Much for coming to join me again tonight. I've been really enjoying talking to the people of Abingdon. We've gone through the First World War and we are now halfway through the Second World War. Now, if you've not made any of the earlier talks, if you're sitting there currently and panicking because you're thinking that you've missed the start of the series, firstly, don't worry, they're all available for free on the museum website. And also, don't worry, this works perfectly fine as a standalone talk. And so tonight, for Remembrance Day, we're going through Germany's fade-in chances in the Second World War. And we're going to take the story of the Second World War from the 5th of December, 1941, to the 23rd of October, 1942. Now, before we begin, let's get some rough idea of where we're going to be concentrating on for tonight. Because a few of these areas we're going to return to again and again, and it helps if you know whereabouts they are. And so the little island of Malta there is going to loom large in our thoughts. British colony under siege by the Germans and the Italians. On the Eastern Front, the city of Sevastopol, again under siege, as is Leningrad in the north, the former capital of Russia, now the second city of the USSR. Now, bit of a spoiler alert of where we're going to be going to throughout the evening, but if you're looking for Stalingrad, you're looking there. If you're looking for the Caucasian oil fields, like Maykop and Baku, then you're looking there. And so, Suez Canal, here. Another spoiler alert, El Alamein, here, Tobruk, there. And so now hopefully we have a rough idea of where we're going to be looking at. We can perhaps start our tour of where we are on the Second World War by the 5th of December 1941. But one more last piece of housekeeping that I should do before we go too far. I know that many of you will be worried about toilet breaks and a return to the bar. There will be an interval, not halfway through. It's going to be roughly around 8:05. That's the longer of the two halves, so that we can then hit the bar, top ourselves up, as it were, then rally, as it were, reform in the theatre, and carry on the offensive. So by the 5th of December, 1941, the German advance on Moscow has been brought to a halt. In the desert, Operation Crusader, the British counter-attack, had begun on the 15th of November, and the Germans and the Italians were being driven back away from Egypt, with the key fortress port of Tobruk had just been relieved. Now, in the Atlantic, that key battleground, the Germans had failed to concentrate on U-boat production or on U-boat technology, and they'd started to suffer increasingly heavy losses at the hands of the Royal Navy. Meanwhile, Malta was a constant thorn, as we're going to see, in the side of the Germans and the Italians trying to supply their armed forces in the desert. While Europe's citizens are getting ever hungrier, and despite their reputation, German industry is being starved of resources, bombed, and is increasingly inefficient, while the British citizenry are well fed and their production is going up and up and up every year. Worse, the Germans are being hindered by some hideous over-engineering of equipment. 1942 is the last realistic chance the Axis have of winning the war in Europe. It is now a now or never gamble to break the British and the Russians in Europe. And so it starts on the 4th and 5th of December. And on that night, before Moscow, the temperatures plummet. They manage to reach minus 35 degrees C, which is where we left the talk as a sort of a cliffhanger last year, if you joined me when I was broadcasting from my study. Machine gun oil freezes for the German army, but the Russian T-34 has been built to withstand these phenomenally low temperatures, and they're still working. The Soviets' counterattack against the German army begins. On the 5th and 6th of December, after just 24 hours of this counterattack, the German General von Bock orders a general withdrawal of Army Group Center away from Moscow. And on the 7th of December, we have this. The American fleet is attacked at Pearl Harbor. Now, as it happens, the British knew this was going to happen. We were aware we'd broken some of the Japanese codes. We knew they were coming for the Americans. And we decided, wisely, not to tell them. For a start, although the American and British governments have been getting ever closer and ever friendlier, the American Navy was not necessarily pro-British. I have a book at home published by an American admiral in 1940 suggesting that now the British Empire is weak, it's time to seize the British Empire and capture the British fleet to make sure the Germans can't achieve hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And also, we must remember that in the 1920s, we'd been planning for war with America, and the Americans had been planning for war with us, what they called Case Red. We've lost a lot of battleships so far in this war, and the Americans have been sitting it out. The idea that the Americans might lose some of this naval superiority over the Royal Navy is not necessarily harmful to British interests. Also, it's valuable to make sure we do get the Americans in the war. We really need this, and there's nothing more likely to get the Americans in the war than a load of Americans being blown up while they're already in port. And so we decide that the Americans don't need to know this kind of information, because this commits them to war on our side rather nicely. Now, Hitler decides at this moment to declare war on the United States of America. Now, his plan, so this is Hitler's plan for victory. The Japanese will beat the British Empire in the Far East. The British Empire will then collapse under the strain. The Americans would be busy fighting against the Japanese. The Germans, meanwhile, would learn the lessons of their 1941 campaign against the Red Army, would prepare to go again, and with their new offensive in the summer, they would smash the Red Army, beat the Russians, and win the war, because the British would obviously surrender with the loss of their Far Eastern Empire and with the loss of their Russian allies, and all would be good. Therefore, on the 11th of December, Germany declares war on the United States of America. It is a disastrous decision for Germany. The American president, Roosevelt, would have found it very difficult to persuade the American public to declare war on Germany when they are already involved with a war with America, so with Japan. They would find it difficult. They would certainly find it difficult. Roosevelt has agreed that in the event of war, that America would concentrate against Germany first. Bearing in mind Japan has just attacked America, the American public want revenge. They want a Japan-first policy. However, the British and Americans have been discussing a Germany-first policy. Roosevelt would find that almost impossible to achieve if it wasn't for the fact that the Germans so handily have decided to declare war upon the United States of America too, hence solving a multitude of problems. He really didn't have to do this. Germany is already, at this stage, short of money, it's short of food, it's short of coal, and it's short of fuel. Fritz Todt and Walter Rowland beg Hitler at this moment to try and come to terms. They say that any sane government would at this moment seek an armistice. They say that they can't see how Germany could win the war at this moment. Despite the huge territorial stretch of the German Empire, they say they don't think that Germany can win. A brave thing to tell Hitler, but they feel that they have no choice. However, he tells them that he has a plan, that it's in hand, and that the Americans are decadent and they can't fight. And so don't be concerned. Meanwhile, in the Bay of Biscay, there is a fierce battle raging just as our talk begins. And the battle is over a convoy called HG 76. It's gone to Gibraltar, the G, and is returning home, HG. And it's the 76th convoy to take this journey. It is a heavily armed convoy, and it's fighting its way back from Gibraltar to Britain. We have here the escort carrier HMS Audacity, which will be sunk in this particular fight. During this battle, 2 warships, including this escort carrier, and 2 of the freighters are sunk on the return journey. But before you think it's a terrible loss, the British have lost an aircraft carrier, perhaps you're thinking of those huge aircraft carriers out in the Pacific. This piece of junk is a transport with a flat deck bolted onto the top of it. We can make, and we do make, dozens of these. Some of them are so small that the aircraft can take off and not land again. We can put flat decks on an awful lot of tankers. However, for the German losses, they lose 4 U-boats, 3 of the rare long-range Condor bombers destroyed, and the U-boat ace Endless is killed. And 30 of the merchantmen get home safe. It's the first big British victory of the Atlantic War. You may not think that a loss of a carrier and a warship against 4 submarines as a victory. The British certainly thought so, as did the head of the German U-boat force. The loss of experienced crews, and in particular U-boat aces like Endless, they are irreplaceable. This requires a bit of steel plating and some old coal-fired transport that happens to be going that way. We can churn these out pretty quick. Now, on the 19th of December, Hitler sacks the head of the army on the Eastern Front, Rundstedt, and his assistant, von Brauchitsch. And he signs that only one man now has the kind of strategic genius to win the war. So he appoints himself as commander-in-chief of the Eastern Theatre, with Keitel as his second in command. Halder, head of the army, is sidelined. In Leningrad, thousands of Russian citizens are dying of starvation. There's a shortage of water, and disease is rife. But the soldiers stay fed, and Stalin cares not a jot for the loss of thousands of Russian citizens. He's killed more citizens than the Russians are losing on the Eastern Front themselves. As far as he's concerned, Hitler is an amateur when it comes to killing Russians. He should leave this to the professionals. And so he cares not for the losses in Leningrad. The Red Army counterattacks around Leningrad. The counterattack begins and to gather pace around the 9th, and by the 9th, the Leningrad railhead at Tikhvin is liberated from the German army, and the German army is pushed back 60 miles away from Leningrad. The city is still under siege, still under constant bombardment. They're still short of food. They're still short of water. And yet now supplies are starting to slowly edge their way into the city. And we can see here the German army before Moscow. These are the conditions that they're currently trying to fight in. The siege, however, continues. On the 22nd of December, the Americans begin Operation Bolero. Now, I don't know about you lot, but when I hear about Bolero, I still think of the ice dancing. Do you remember? You know, live from Nottingham ice dancers doing the Bolero, and just like them, they're going to waltz, as it were, a load of American troops into Britain. And so the 22nd of December, it's Operation Bolero, the rush to get American troops into Britain. Now, the Americans are already planning an annual production of 45,000 aircraft and 25,000 tanks a year. Now, yes, a lot of those aircraft are junk. Yes, a lot of those tanks, questionable in some of their design choices, however, mechanically highly reliable, and that's ultimately what matters most if you're trying to win a war. 25,000, however, is a huge number. That will add to the British production. The British are producing 8,600 tanks a year. Now, think about those numbers for a minute. The Americans are planning 25,000 tanks a year. The British are already making 8,600 tanks a year. Better design, mechanically a lot less reliable, however. If only you could get some British designers to get some Americans to make some tanks, we could actually have had some decent war material. However, that is huge numbers of tanks when you consider that Germany, across all fronts, in the desert, in the home armies, in France, in Russia, the Germans have, in total, in the field, 6,842 serviceable vehicles. And a lot of those aren't tanks. A lot of those are armoured cars. Some of those are captured French and Czech models, which are now becoming ever harder to maintain. And so the British are producing more in a year than the Germans have in service. And that's before we look at the huge American production. On the 25th of December, the brilliant German general Guderian is sacked. He's the one that literally wrote the book on Blitzkrieg. However, he won't be told by Hitler what to do or how to command tanks. And so he goes. Hitler orders the German army in the east to hold fast. No retreat, not one step back. And Balck agrees with him. And as it happens, this was probably the best choice that could be made at this stage. You might say, why? Already, a lot of the German vehicles, they are frozen, they are broken down. If the German army tries to retreat from these positions, a lot of their formations are already immobile. Already, too many vehicles have been abandoned. Too many people have been captured and killed as units try and fall back. The German army can't fall back into this situation. They have to stand and fight and hope they just don't get overrun and overwhelmed. And so, as it happens, it was a sensible choice and a good start for Hitler's generalship on the Eastern Front. Let's hope for the German soldiers' point of view that he manages to keep up this good run of form. Now, Hitler, however, then makes a terrible decision. Now, please, put your hands up if you have a teenage child who's learning to drive or have had a teenage child who has driven. Yes, there's some shifty-looking teenagers. How many of you would trust them to go on a long journey without you? Because I wouldn't, is what I'm saying. But this is the plan. Hitler knows that this army is desperately short of supplies. And in the Second World War, by the way, the single most important vehicle is not an aircraft or a tank, it's a truck. The Second World War is a war that will be won and lost by trucks. And the German army is desperately short of trucks to move supplies, because I like to eat, preferably every day. And if I have a gun and people are running at me, I'd like to have some bullets to try and chuck at them. And all of this stuff will come in trucks. And so trucks will decide who wins and loses. And Hitler is aware of this, and so he orders 10,000 trucks to be gathered from the length and breadth of the German Empire. But there's a problem. How to get these 10,000 trucks that are loaded with winter clothing and winter supplies for the German army, how to get them from Europe over to the east when you're a bit short of men? Well, thank God for the Hitler Youth, because the Hitler Youth is told to drive these 10,000 trucks around Europe up to Warsaw, where the army will collect them and drive them the rest of the way. By a minor miracle, most of those 10,000 trucks get to Warsaw with their supplies. But by the time they get to Warsaw, and bearing in mind, the German soldiers aren't fighting at Warsaw, they're fighting just short of Moscow, but they've reached Warsaw. By the time they get to Warsaw, most of those 10,000 trucks have been reduced to utter scrap. They start to take them apart for spare parts. If you can imagine someone driving 100 miles and forgetting to lift the handbrake, not knowing how to work the gears, you can see that mechanically these things now have been absolutely ruined. Germany has just lost, in the matter of a week, 10,000 priceless, irreplaceable trucks. The RAF could only dream of achieving this much in a month's worth of bombing, quite frankly. The Hitler Youth have done a great service for the Allied war effort. And so do try and remember that if you're trying to teach your child to drive. But the fighting continues and the losses start to mount. By the 5th of January, on the Eastern Front alone, Germany has lost 830,903 men. Because although they've not taught the Hitler Youth to drive properly, they are keeping meticulous records of casualties. It's 25.96% of their entire army. So short of men are they on the Eastern Front that they decide to take 5 divisions out of the German Home Army to ship out to the east. Now, I know we have this idea that the German army is superbly well trained, and bits of it are. Bits of the German army are superbly trained, combat veterans, highly motivated. Most of the German army, rather badly trained, because they're not designed to be sent to the front line. They've called up too many men. Large armies are notoriously inefficient. I've taught in schools, in comprehensive schools, large armies take everybody. I was teaching a 16-year-old today, 16. They asked me why the Spanish Armada didn't walk to Britain. I broke the news to them that we're an island and there's some water in the way, and they were surprised. They were surprised that there was some water between us and Spain. The army, though, takes everybody if the army is large enough. So some of the army is not going to be that bright. Some of the army is going to be practically untrainable. And so the home army is told to give up 5 divisions. They are partially trained at best, and they're shipped to the front. The Germans also empty the prisons, just like, by the way, Russia is currently doing in their war at the moment in the Ukraine. You empty the prisons of the soldiers, hurl them to the front. They also form Valkyrie divisions by calling up industrial workers. This is heroically stupid for a war which is going to be decided by industrial potential. Just like the French made the terrible mistake in 1939 of calling up everybody who worked in the Renault tank factory, giving them a rifle and telling them to dig trenches instead of making tanks. Now the Germans have called up Valkyrie divisions, men who work in the factories, making weapons, making trucks. They have now been told to get a bolt-action rifle and go out to the east. Of course, the situation for manpower in the east is worsened by the Holocaust. There are millions of people who would have, if they could have, fought for Germany. Germany's Jewish population fought gallantly, loyally for Germany in the First World War. If you go around German war cemeteries, you'll know if you come across a German Jewish war memorial, because there are little stones left on top of the grave. Many of them would have happily fought for Germany had they not been cheated so terribly by the Nazi government. So not only have they killed some men of their own when they're desperately short of men, they've used their own men to do it. There are men rounding up Germans to kill Germans when there are Germans desperately needed on the Eastern Front. And of course, to do this takes precious trucks and industrial potential. It's an insane misuse of resources, even beyond the crime against humanity. It makes no sense on any level. Now, in the Atlantic, 2,336 British and Allied merchantmen have been sunk. 2,336. That is a lot of ships. However, it's only 2% of what Britain and the Allies had available at the start of the war. Gives you some idea of just how wealthy and how powerful Britain was in 1939. That this 2,336 ships was just 2% of our total. And so it is not impinged on our ability to communicate with our empire. And British anti-submarine technology is improving rapidly, while Donitz's experienced U-boat crews are steadily being killed or captured, and the U-boat design now is obsolete. It was getting obsolete in 1939. The U-boats they're making now are most definitely obsolete. We call the U-boat a submarine in school textbooks. In reality, it's not. To get technical, it's a submersible because it travels best and fights best on the surface, not underwater. A proper submarine, and they had designed proper submarines, just not built them, should be able to operate underwater far better than the U-boat. So the U-boat's actually a submersible, not a submarine. They had, however, in 1940, designed a proper submarine. However, because of the high cost of this design, and because it was a highly technical design that took longer to build, they had decided to reject the design. Also, they had real doubts over the safety of its hydrogen peroxide engines, and so they never pursued it. Now, Dönitz hurls his U-boats into the Caribbean at this time. He says that we're going to concentrate on the Caribbean, where there are loads of American merchantmen sailing from what we'd consider the Caribbean and Central America. Back then, it's referred to as the Dutch West Indies and Venezuela. And so there are loads of American ships sailing with oil, lovely targets that, to America to fuel the American war economy with oil. And these are really badly defended because the American fleet is concentrating on the Pacific. They've suddenly got quite a lot to do. The American ships that aren't in the Pacific are in the Atlantic, helping the British with their convoy duties there. The Caribbean has been left wide open and exposed. It is the happy time for the U-boat campaign. They're going to hit the Americans hard in the Caribbean. But how can they do this? They have 91 U-boats in service. Now that might seem a lot. That's far lower than they should have had. U-boats don't take much steel compared to a battleship. But of these 91, 22 of them are in the Mediterranean. That is a real mistake. The Mediterranean has lovely blue waters. When Italy entered the war, they had the largest submarine fleet in the world. It lasted a matter of months because British aircraft flying over the Mediterranean could look down and go, oh, look, there's a submarine down there. And we could see them because the Mediterranean Sea is relatively shallow, nice, blue. You can see to the bottom in quite a lot of it, especially for the submarines operating there. The Royal Navy had a field day hunting those Italian submarines out. But because the Italian submarines have been sunk, 22 German U-boats have been transferred by Hitler's personal command to the Mediterranean with these nice clear waters so that we can pick them out. There are another 3 on the way to join them. 6 of them are off Gibraltar. 4 of them have been sent by Hitler to guard Norway because he's convinced the British Army are about to launch an invasion of Norway to liberate that country from the Germans. So 4 of them have been sent up there with absolutely nothing to do at this stage. Now, of the rest, 60% are still awaiting repair. Some of them have been waiting repair for months because Hitler has said that any steel given to the Navy has to be given first to repair the battleships, which take a lot of steel. And so you have valuable U-boats sitting waiting for months while they work on these giant warships trying to repair them. So there were actually only 22 submarines left for this attack on the Caribbean. And half of those are currently going back to Germany for resupply and rearming. Despite this, it's a happy time for the U-boats. From January to February, the U-boats sink 71 merchantmen. 61 of them are in the American zone. In the March, they sink 92, joined by Italian submarines attacking the meat convoys off Brazil. Of those 92 sunk, 89 of them are American ships in the American zone. The British are in convoy, heavily guarded. The Americans were told by the British and Canadians, you're going to want to put your merchantmen into convoys. The American Admiralty decided that the British didn't understand how convoy war worked. We've been fighting for 2 years. We have a reasonable idea of how to deal with these U-boats. But the Americans decide that unless you have enough escorts, convoys are too vulnerable. It just gets a load of targets into one place. So they refuse to put their ships into convoys. They keep on sending them through unguarded on their own. They are hugely reluctant to take British and Canadian advice. And so American ships keep on being sent to the bottom in greater and greater numbers. Now, in the desert, as we continue our little tour around the world, Operation Crusader is slowly running out of steam. The Royal Navy continues to attack the Italian supply lines and sink 2 large passenger ships bound for Libya on the 13th of December, and 2 of the Italian heavy cruisers. But they're not having it all their own way. Italian mini-subs attack the British fleet in port and cripple the British battleships Valiant and Queen Elizabeth, 2 of the more modern of our battleships. And so this is the Valiant, just before it gets crippled by Italian mini-submarines. After this, Britain has not a single battleship operational in the Mediterranean to face the Italian fleet. However, the 8th Army continues to advance. Now let's take a whistle-stop tour of some key desert locations. And so we're going to start here, El Alamein. And then they've pushed the axis back to El Alamein. So it's there. Benghazi. Tobruk. Mersa Matruh. So El Alamein, Mersa Matruh, Tobruk, Benghazi, El Alamein. The British have pushed the Germans and Italians back to El Alamein by this stage. So that's where we currently are. At the Battle of El Alamein, their last of their advance, the British have 90 tanks still operational, but 51 of them are lost in that battle, halting the operation. But there are still huge numbers of German and Italian troops scattered across this desert, left behind the lines. And so the British stop to mop up these German and Italian forces. And that takes up until the 17th of January. In Crusader, the British actually had been slightly outnumbered by the Germans and the Italians, but they had had control of the air and more tanks. In that campaign, the British had taken around 15% casualties, the Axis 32% casualties, and Tobruk had been relieved. Crusader had been disappointing. The Afrika Korps had escaped. We'd hoped to destroy the Afrika Korps around Tobruk. They had managed to wheedle their way out of our trap. However, the campaign had broadly been a success. But we hadn't won the war. We had formed now proper armoured forces, much like the German Panzer Force, where you have tanks, truck-borne infantry, truck-carried artillery. We've also produced our own model of that, where you have British tanks with motorised and mechanised infantry, towed guns. However, our panzer divisions as well, our armoured forces, are smaller. We decide not to produce whole divisions of these. We decide to keep them in brigade formations. And so, although we have the same idea as the Germans, we've decided that smaller units are better because therefore they can be in more places, be more tactically flexible. It is a mistake. In January, Rommel counter-attacks and pushes the British back to Gazala, 60 miles west of Tobruk, retaking Benghazi. Worse, on the 15th of February, Singapore falls to the Japanese. It is a huge humiliation for the British Empire and really spells the end of our Far Eastern Empire. But with Singapore gone, with its 250,000 soldiers, we need to get some soldiers out to the east quick. We need some soldiers who can fight, who are equipped, who know what they're doing. Where can we find these soldiers? Well, they're going to have to come from the Desert Army. So just like on the verge of victory in 1940 against the Italians, we pulled out British and Australian troops from the desert and sent them to fight in Greece and lost the chance of winning the Desert War. We are once again going shopping for troops and aircraft from our desert army. And so just as our offensive Crusader grinds to a halt, and we're now fighting around here, we need to take troops away from the desert fighting to go and fight the Japanese. 2 Australian and 1 British division are withdrawn to go and be sent off to fight in the east, as are 300 fighters and 139 Blenheim bombers. Not that the Blenheim bomber is very good at this stage, but at least it can fly over people and drop stuff on their heads. It has a role. As an aside, if we'd have sent 300 fighters and 139 Blenheim bombers while Singapore was still fighting, it probably wouldn't have fallen in the first place, and we wouldn't have had to strip all these troops from the desert. As an aside also, if we weren't shipping so many good Spitfires and Hurricane to the Russians and sent some of those to Singapore, again, Singapore wouldn't have fallen. We did send aircraft to Singapore. We sent the American-built Buffalo Brewster. Now, you try and find a child who's built a scale model of a Buffalo Brewster. Try and go around some toy shops and find a model of it. You won't. They were junk. Even when we bought them, we thought, they look pretty rubbish. We were giving stuff to the Russians for free. We took one look at the Buffalo Brewster and thought, they're not going to accept this. And so we sent them out to Singapore to try and frighten the Japanese. If we'd have shipped some of those Buffalo Brewster to the Russians, and I'm just saying that compared to some of the junk they were making, it was comparable, and sent some Hurricane and Spitfire to Singapore, the Japanese might not have attacked us in the first place. But we did, rightly, we thought the key frontier was the Eastern Front. But sometimes you've got to look after yourself. As I was talking to a few of you while drinking wine before the start, my grandfather fought in Singapore. He'd have loved to have seen the skies above his head protected by a Spitfire or even a Mark I Hurricane as opposed to those Buffalo Brewster. He'd have really appreciated that, quite frankly. And as a teenage boy, I got given many a lecture on the problems of Buffalo Brewsters. And I'm saying it would have improved my childhood not to receive the lecture you've just received on the Buffalo Brewster every Wednesday after school for about 2 years. It would have helped many people. But even so, our desert army and air force is stripped, and we lose air superiority over the desert. Also, American supplies to the desert theatre temporarily come to a halt. Why? The Americans now would rather like these supplies for themselves, so although their industry is gearing up rapidly, there is a temporary dip in the arrival of supplies as we start to ship stuff around the Pacific and they keep stuff for themselves. Worse, you must have noticed there was a lot of snow in that picture of the Eastern Front. Aircraft don't like to fly in that snow, and there were lots of German aircraft on the Eastern Front in that snow. They withdraw these aircraft from the Eastern Front where they can't fly and send them to somewhere they can, sunny Mediterranean. And so the 2nd German Air Wing is withdrawn from the Eastern Front and sent to Sicily as the weather is too bad to fight on the Eastern Front, with the aim of bombing Malta. And so we have here the Malta Blitz. Now, by February, the island is running badly low of supplies, but it's a vital fortress. British aircraft operating out of Malta have already sunk 350,000 tons of Italian shipping. The German dive bombers take huge losses over the island of Malta. So the dive bombers are withdrawn. But the level bombing, that kind of bombing, continues. In March, however, the British defenders are starting to run badly low on supplies. A convoy is going to have to go through to Malta, even though we have no battleships to guard that convoy from the Italian surface fleet, which is one of the most powerful in the world. They start to fight their way across the Mediterranean. And by the 23rd of March, 3 out of 4 of those tankers managed to make it to the island. It's an incredibly heroic effort. Attacked by aircraft, ships, submarines, they managed to nonetheless fight their way through to resupply the island. They get to the island. But the island decides not to use the British soldiers to unload the ships, and instead to use the unionised dock workers that are already on the island. After 3 days of those ships sitting on the island, they still have barely started to unload the precious supplies that have got through to the island. Because they don't work in the night, and they have very, very carefully protected working hours. And they're damned if they're going to give them up. Another wave of German bombers come over the island and see these transports still in the dock, and they sink the lot. The island is desperately short of air cover. At this stage in the war, it also has not received any Spitfires to help protect them, but it really should have done. The Germans are attacking it with 385 bombers, but only around 115 fighters. If we want to help the Russians, sending some Spitfires out to Malta and shooting those German aircraft down before they can go back to the Eastern Front is a good way to go about it, because we have some really great pilots. But they're staying in Britain. And Britain is hoarding what Spitfires they're keeping for themselves on the British home islands, rather than sending them out around the empire. Now, by April, Malta's towns and harbours have been levelled in the Maltese Blitz. The airfields there have been wrecked. Even the British submarines are having to abandon the island. On the 17th of April, the island is given the George Cross for its bravery, although I'm fairly sure they'd have preferred modern fighters. On the 20th of April, finally, the British government decides to send out 47 modern Spitfires to protect the island. Unfortunately, they don't bother to tell the island the Spitfires are on the way, because secrecy is essential. And so the island is a bit surprised when some Spitfires drop down, and so they have no bomb-proof hangars prepared to receive these Spitfires. Within 24 hours, most of them have been bombed on the ground. Within 48 hours, only 7 of these precious aircraft are left operational. It's simply too little, too late. But the Allies are at least winning the production war. On the 26th of January, those American troops in Operation Bolero finally arrive. The 34th Red Bull Division is now in Britain. And in the first quarter of the year, the British had produced 559 fighter aircraft. 559. The Americans have produced 320. Against this vast number of aircraft, which of course doesn't include the Russian production, Germany, with its huge empire, has managed 221 aircraft. Britain alone is producing nearly twice the number of fighter aircraft that the Germans and their empire are producing. Their industry is hugely inefficient. But by February 1942, Britain is thinking about stopping the bomber offensive against Germany. We're not sure it's worth bombing Germany. Now, that might sound odd. We're not hitting the targets. In fact, we're not getting within 5 miles of the targets. We have occasionally tried to bomb Berlin and missed Berlin. It's not a small place, and we can't hit it. And so our young men are dying in their hundreds to drop bombs, God knows where, across the German countryside. People are starting to say, is it really worth it? Especially as the Blitz had shown that even just hitting civilian targets won't break a country's morale. Our argument is, if the British civilians hadn't cracked under the Blitz, the German civilian morale won't collapse either. So therefore, we're just wasting our time and killing civilians. One man doesn't agree. This man here, nicknamed Bomber Harris. He has a different plan, and he is made C&C of Bomber Command. His plan would these days be considered a war crime. He decides it doesn't matter if you can't hit the factories. If you can't hit the factories, stop aiming for the factories. Just kill Germans. Hit their cities, and then hit them again and again and again. Because eventually you'll kill someone who matters to the war effort. And as far as he's concerned, he's prepared to fight to the very last German civilian. He is desperate to avoid a return to trench warfare. Remember, he doesn't know how the war's going to end. As far as the British are concerned, we might need to find a beach somewhere, storm it, Gallipoli style, and then start some kind of battle of the Somme to grind our way through the German army if we're unlucky. We're trying to avoid that. He's desperate to avoid that. And so he's prepared to kill as many German civilians as necessary. As far as he's concerned, they started it, so they have no right to complain. It's not exactly a complex argument of moral high ground, but it does have a certain practicality. And so he only has to do this, however, 378 bombers. And of those, only 69 are modern, heavy, 4-engined bombers. Most of them are 2-engined bombers. They can't carry many bombs. They're pretty obsolete. But the Lancaster is finally starting to enter service. Now, some Wellingtons are withdrawn from the Middle East by him to try and reinforce the bombing campaign. But the problem is that those Wellingtons are badly needed in the desert. The desert have just sent hundreds of aircraft out to the east, and now the island that makes those bombers has asked for some bombers to be taken back off their hands and sent back to Britain to bomb Germany. The Desert Air Force really need those Wellingtons. And the Middle East also needs fighters, especially the new Mark V Spitfire. But they're still being hoarded in Britain, rather than being sent out to Malta, the desert, and to Singapore. Now, on the Eastern Front, the Germans are desperately trying to build. The Eastern Front at this time is an interesting lull. The German army is on its last legs. Their line's really thin. So they're going, right, quieten down, lads. Couple of months quiet, trying to get some more men to the front, then we'll win the war. The Russians have taken huge losses, so their lines are pretty thin. So they're largely going, easy lads, keep quiet for a couple of months, we'll build up the numbers, then we'll win the war. Both sides are keen for a little bit of a lull to try and recover from their losses. The Soviet counterattack had been beaten off, but the Soviets are planning an offensive perhaps towards Kharkov. However, as we're going to see, it will end badly for them. The Soviets punch a 50-mile hole through the German lines near Kharkov, with the idea of swarming into the Ukraine. However, the German army counterattack. The Germans had concentrated some troops around Dnepropetrovsk to try and counterattack, and then they encircle the Russian forces and destroy them. On the 7th of February, the Soviet counterattack is wiped out. But on that same day, the head of the German production is killed in a plane crash, Todt. And so Todt, who's been running the German economy, killed in a plane crash. Albert Speer, Hitler's personal architect, was meant to be on that plane as well. However, he'd had a bit of a party the night before, and we've all been there. You oversleep, you realise you missed your flight. And he was so glad when he heard that that plane had crashed and he wasn't on it. So sometimes drinking can save lives, is what I'm saying. And to his surprise, he is summoned in to see Hitler and given Todt's job. He's told, you will run the German war economy. Now he points out he's an architect. He's not an industrial specialist. It turns out he is a genius at managing an economy. Now, amazingly, he survives not to be prosecuted for war crimes. He claims he didn't know about the Holocaust, even though he helped to organise the railway network and where the trucks were going. He said he had no idea why those people only needed one-way tickets and that he didn't ask. And so he didn't get prosecuted and instead was brought in as an advisor to the British post-war economy. So I'm saying, who got the last laugh? With what happened to our economy after the war, he continued his work, quite frankly, of the war years in trying to bring us down. But he managed to survive the war. But he'd got on very well with the head of the Luftwaffe, Erhard Milch. And those two of them worked to try and improve the efficiency of German war production. Now, Hitler's plan for 42 in the east was now to destroy Leningrad and Moscow by aerial bombing, just like he'd destroyed London, I suppose, aerial bombing and artillery, while he would drive for the Middle East. He would go through the Caucasus, capture the oil fields, and then link up with one German army swinging through Egypt, through Iraq, into Persia, join up with the German army going through the Caucasus and control the world's oil supplies. It is, by the way, absolute fantasy that you can do that. That is a man in the First World War who had commanded 10 men trying to come up with grand strategy. You couldn't do it. Even if you conquered that area, which would be difficult enough, you couldn't get the oil back to Germany. There are no pipelines. And they have no plans and no manpower to build those pipelines. Even if they capture the oil, it's worthless to them, although it will at least deprive it from us. And so that is the plan. To build for all of this, they need a lot of equipment. So they cancel all steel exports to Italy. And the Navy has its steel rations slashed. There's also a new tank designed to counter the T-34, the Panzer V tank, and so the Panther, and a new machine gun, the MG-42. They love that on computer games. It's the fastest firing machine gun in the world, and cheaper than the one it replaced. It took half the time to produce as the MG-34. It still, however, takes longer to make than the British Bren gun. Now you're about to go, yes, but this will kick out a lot more bullets than the British Bren gun will. Yes, it will. That's not necessarily an advantage, though. I require one bullet to stop me. You put a bullet in me, I'm out. Quite frankly, I'm probably dead. If I'm not dead, I've certainly stopped fighting. I've got a hole in me. You don't need to put 1,000 bullets into me to make me stay down. The Bren gun has a lower rate of fire, but only so many bullets are going to be useful. And if you're trying to ship bullets 1,000 miles, the idea that some trigger-happy 18-year-old can burn 1,000 of them off in a minute does give you some supply problems and does suggest a certain overkill. And so, although, yes, this will outshoot the Bren gun and is feared by the troops, it has real problems. It overheats. You need 6 spare barrels for the MG-42. You only need 1 spare barrel for the Bren gun. It ate through ammunition. And Germany is running badly short of food, of motor vehicles, and it's dependent on captured models. Now, thinking about trucks, it's got 1,300 different types of truck in service. Now, stop and think for that for a minute. 1,300 different types of truck. They've been captured from the nations of Europe. Some of them are British, whose spare parts, therefore, are in imperial measurements. Some of them have been made by the Czechs or the Poles or the Italians. Some of them are Russian. Some of them are American trucks captured from the British or the Russians. The world has emptied trucks into Europe. Now think about the German industry's problems of trying to make spare parts for this. Can you imagine a truck breaking down and going, right, well, we need a new gearbox. And then somebody getting the list of parts out and going, right, well, can you start by telling me which nationality made your truck, please? And what year? Oh, you stripped all the civilian models too. Great, well, there's another book there. To try and go through spare parts for 1,300 models is a huge task. And you're going to get Germans being told, yeah, well, actually, your nearest spare gearbox is 900 miles that way. And then you need to get a truck to put the spare gearbox on, to move the gearbox to where the broken down truck is. And so by using captured models, in the short term, you increase the number of trucks you have. In the long term, however, your industry is just groaning under the strain of trying to get these working. Also, in 1941, the harvest had been really poor across Europe, everywhere except for in Britain, where there'd been a record harvest. And so Europe is really hungry. And so they now are going to struggle to try and feed their population. They need workers to work on the land. And so this political party, the Nazi Party, Germany for the Germans, desperately needs to find some people to work in the German farms. So they decide to import 34,000 foreign workers into Germany every month, mostly Russian prisoners of war. And so a war that started for Germany for the Germans is now getting 34,000 Russians a month brought in to work on the German countryside to try and feed the Germans. And a lot of these people don't want to stay put. Now, in April, it's so bad, they have to cut their food ration by half. Now, by 1942, they're so desperate for food, the plan now is that the German army in the east will be fed by taking food from Ukraine, taking it off their civilians, giving it to the army, so that everything grown in Europe can at least be eaten in Europe. It is also at this time that the Wannsee Conference in 1942 decides upon the final solution. They decide that Europe is now so short of food that they're going to stop feeding the Jews entirely and kill all the Jews of Europe just to try and cope with the shortage of food on the continent. They simply can't feed them. This is the moment that resistance in Europe really starts to grow. Now, if you go to school in France, they will teach you about the heroics of the French resistance. One thing that's worth remembering is that more French soldiers die because of the British or fighting the British than because of the Germans. And the French army fought pretty well against the British in Syria and Madagascar. But this is the moment that across Europe resistance really starts to increase because they are hungry and their people are being killed. And you can't blame them now for resisting. So I've got here an example. 100 Norwegians decided to make their way to Britain to resist the Germans. So they cross into Russia. From Russia, they go to India. From India, they go to Egypt. From Egypt, they go to South Africa. There, they go to Britain. They get trained as commandos, where the British are looking for some people to launch a commando raid on Norway. And they get sent back to Norway as British commandos to launch an attack there. One of them actually ends up attacking the same village that he left from nearly a year before. It's an incredible journey around the world. But what an effort. They destroy 4 explosive batteries and kill or capture 200 German soldiers. So the journey was worth it. Now, by the end of April, Hitler meets Mussolini to set the plan. It'll begin with a combined invasion of Malta to be launched, led by the Italians and supported by Germans, 1 paratroop division and the Luftwaffe. A few weeks later, however, the plan is cancelled as Hitler didn't think that he could trust the Italians to fight. Also, Rommel wants to launch his attack against the British in the desert and is desperate for those aircraft. And those aircraft can't be in 2 places at once. They have the choice of going for Malta or launching the desert offensive, and Rommel is determined to launch the desert offensive. But it's a mistake. They should have gone for Malta first. On the 9th of May, 61 Spitfires arrive in Malta, and this time we tell the island to expect them to arrive. Malta is back in the fight. Germany and Italy have so far lost nearly 500 aircraft in the skies over Malta, giving you some idea of the scale of the conflict there. From January to May, they'd lost 100 to anti-aircraft fire alone. Now, out in the Atlantic, the U-boat campaign continues its grim harvest, and the Americans still haven't put their ships into convoys. In May, 125 ships are sunk. Only 14 of those are in convoy. In June, 144 ships are sunk. Of those 144, only 23 are in convoy. They've really got to start convoying. It's 650,000 tons of merchant shipping. And that's appalling losses. But the U-boat's target is 800,000 tons. So they're still not hitting the target they've set themselves. Now, Rommel's plan for the desert is for the Italians to launch an attack in the north and centre to pin the British army in place, while the Germans sweep round through the desert, through the south, to come up behind the British, encircle the British desert army and destroy it. It's a good plan, with the south of the British line, held by the Free French at the fort of Bir Hakeim. However, the Africa Corps supply lines are 800 miles long, and they need 60,000 tons of supplies a month. In April, instead of 60,000 tons, they got 18,000. That's a big shortfall in supplies. Rommel thinks that the Desert War might already have been lost, with British supplies once again flowing through South Africa up to Egypt. Now, to support his attack, he has 497 serviceable planes and another 739 German aircraft across the Mediterranean that could be called upon. But they do include some rather nice new kit. They do include things like this, the brand new Bf-109F, their latest design, sent out into the desert, superior to anything the Desert Air Force has. The Desert Air Force is flying the American-built Kitty Hawk and the British Hurry Bomber. It's the Hurricane we've strapped some bombs and rockets to. Now, the Kitty Hawk and Hurry Bomber, they are perfectly reliable. They are good fighter bombers. But like any multi-role aircraft, they don't excel at any one particular thing. The 109F is an out-and-out fighter that will hack these things from the sky. However, say what you like about these two, particularly this one, makes for an expert tank buster, hitting the tanks with their thin armour on the top. So they are not a waste of time. They are lovely aircraft for their role. And so the 26th of May, the attack begins. Rommel has 560 tanks. By the way, people say the Desert War doesn't matter because of the small numbers of men. The Desert War really matters because although the number of men are low, the number of machines is absurdly high. As we're going to see again and again, the amount of trucks and tanks and planes out in the desert, it's a mechanized war. What the German army on the Eastern Front could have done with those machines instead of having them chased across the desert. So Rommel has 560 tanks, but 230 of these are obsolete Italian tanks. The British have 850 tanks, including 400 of the new American-built Grant tanks, which are lovely vehicles. Also, we know that they're coming. Ultra has told us the very day of the German attack. And so our forces out there are commanded by Neil Ritchie. By the way, this is him in the middle. This is his style of command. This is not a heroic style of command of a man pointing out, go. This is war by committee, as we're going to see. We're commanded by Neil Ritchie. He's a competent staff officer with very little combat experience. He does not have the respect of his divisional or corps commanders, which is why this, at this time of the war, is the traditional view of him. He gives orders that get ignored. They argue back. They won't listen. They won't do what they're told. They have no respect for him. His reputation in the wider war, appalling. It's not really fair, to be honest. It's often forgotten this man will be a corps commander in the Normandy campaign, and he will be an excellent corps commander. However, as a commander of a general, he's utter rubbish because he doesn't have the experience, he doesn't have the respect of his corps commanders. He has been grossly over-promoted, and it's going to show. The man we should have had is this man here, Francis Tucker. And so Ritchie, without respect, is there trying to plan the defence. Now, Rommel, on the other hand, compared to Ritchie, he has dash. He's an excellent general, but has a poor understanding of air power and logistics. As far as he's concerned, supplies are somebody else's problem. As long as you can get supplies to him, he knows what to do with them. How those supplies get there, not really his thing. And so Rommel, he's a proper boy's own style general. When it comes to tactics, leadership, the respect of his men, he's got it all. Great for war films, therefore. When it comes to sitting down working out how that tank's going to move from there to there and where the petrol's going to come from, that's really not his forte. The boring paperwork he can leave to somebody else. But wars are won by boring paperwork. And so the British have their mobile forces, just like Germany, but remember, much smaller than the Germans. Now, Francis Tucker, as the British dig in around Tobruk, Tucker comes up with a plan. He says, ignore the trench lines, fortify Tobruk, pull back, form two proper armoured divisions on the German Panzer Division model, put them together with the highly mechanised 4th Indian Division, let the Germans blunt themselves on the fortress of Tobruk, and then when they're exhausted, hit them with a highly mobile campaign to romp our way towards victory. He wants to see Britain beat the Germans at their own game of lightning war. He's put in charge of training of mobile forces. He has confidence. He's talking about concentration of force. As after all, as Rommel said to a captured British officer, what does it matter if you have 2 tanks to my 1 if you spread yours across a desert and let me destroy them in small detail? And so Tucker says abandon the Gaza line, fortify Tobruk, have a mobile counter-attack. And he was actually equal in rank to Ritchie, so he could have been put in control of the battle. However, Auchinleck, who's in command of the Mediterranean theatre, felt personally threatened by Tucker. If you read his diaries, he's really convinced that Tucker's after his job and wants to sideline him to a training role so that he doesn't get the glory of the victory of the Gazala line, whereas Ritchie, he thinks he can use and control. The British infantry on the eve of the battle hear the German engines warming up and hear the German vehicles on their way, but their reports are ignored. The Germans sweep around the desert, going round the British lines, and then advance in 4 columns behind the British lines, right behind them to try and encircle them. By midday, they've reached Knightsbridge. Now they're my local boys, the Sherwood Yeomanry. And these poor blokes, they were sent out to Palestine in 1939 with horses and lances, as they were a cavalry force. They had then been retrained to use field guns. They had had 1 day's training on them 6 months before, and then been given the manual when they were told to give their horses and lances back and take the guns. And so you had the embarrassing picture of men going, wait a minute, how do these things work again? Well, they're in the way of the Germans, and fair play, they fought quite well at the Battle of Knightsbridge, fighting at point-blank range to try and blunt the German attacks. And the Germans are indeed halted behind the lines. Well, this is Kharkov. I should have got these in the right order. Here we go. And so you've got the British Gazala line. Germans have come round Bir Hakeim, hit Knightsbridge in the Battle of Knightsbridge. British soldiers here, Italians here, Germans here, more British soldiers here. Yes, they're trying to encircle us, but the Africa Corps is here, between British forces. We've also got them trapped, just as well as they've got us trapped. And they've been halted at the Battle of Knightsbridge. And the British have kept their tank forces concentrated around here, ready for a swift counterattack to annihilate the Afrika Korps, if we could just take the chance. Rommel and his Afrika Korps risk annihilation in this battle. Meanwhile, in the wider war, as a bit of a cliffhanger really, British troops have landed at Madagascar to fight the French. We were worried that the Japanese were going to seize the island of Madagascar off the French and use it as a base to raid the Indian Ocean. The 8,000 French soldiers on Madagascar fight fiercely against the British, but are eventually overcome. Now, the Americans are planning for an invasion of France in 1943. They want D-Day to be the 1st of April, 1943. However, they are preparing an invasion in 1942 if the war in Russia goes badly. This D-Day 1942 is to be done by 3.5 divisions plus 700 aircraft. The British want nothing to do with the D-Day 1942 plan. They say it's insane. Now, Italy sends 7 divisions to fight in Russia to join the 3 divisions already out there. Rationing in Italy is now so bad that Italian citizens are getting 1,000 calories a day. Your weight will drop at that. You'll lose a pound of fat every 4 days if you have a moderately active job doing that kind of diet. In Czechoslovakia, the resistance forces assassinate Heydrich on the 31st of May. And in the east, the Russians and Germans continue their preparations for the attack. Now, the Germans want to clean the Izium salient first, and then the Crimea, and then launch their Case Blue, the race for the Caucasus and Stalingrad, at the end of June. They need time to replace their losses of 41. In 41, though, they'd ran out of time. They were stopped days before Moscow. And now they're wasting time again. The 1942 attack will start 1 week later than their 1941 attack, when they'd ran out of time. And so the Soviets attack first in the Battle of Kharkov. The second Battle of Kharkov begins on the 12th of May. Launched out of the Izium salient. Once again, they punch a hole in the German lines, and again, von Bock counterattacks, encircles the Soviet forces. By the 28th of May, the Red Army has lost 240,000 soldiers, 1,200 tanks, and 2,600 guns in the Second Battle of Kharkov. The losses are huge, while the Germans continue to prepare for their offensive. In the desert, the British continue to fight around Knightsbridge, with the Afrika Korps trapped behind British lines. On the 23rd of May, the Italians tried to seize Bir Hakeim to try and support the Afrika Korps. But the French Foreign Legion fight bravely and destroy 32 Italian tanks before driving the Italians back out of Bir Hakeim, and they capture the Italian commander. By the way, the Italian commander on the attack at Bir Hakeim was loved by the French army. In the First World War, he'd been a member of the French army, and when he was captured, he was still wearing his French First World War medals. He'd fought in the First World War in the French army, fighting against the Germans, and in the Second World War, he was commanding the Italians, fighting with the Germans against the French. And so when they realised who they captured, they would invite him to the officers' mess for evening meals. Apparently, he had a fine fund of stories, and also was on hand to give some sound tactical advice about what the Germans and his fellow Italians were going to do. He apparently had quite a nice post-war time, and so he had a final catch-up. Now, a concerted attack at this time could have wiped out the Afrika Korps. The Afrika Korps is trapped and is being saved only by its anti-tank guns. Everyone is thinking, a concentrated attack on the Afrika Korps, wipe them out. But Ritchie decides to delay to wait for reports to come back from his patrols. The Italians again try and break through to free the Afrika Korps, supported by the Luftwaffe, who have lost contact with Rommel. Rommel was notoriously lazy when talking to the Luftwaffe, and he decides it's not worth telling his own air force what's going on. They can't get hold of him, and so the Luftwaffe tries to support the Italians breaking through to try and rescue him. And they do manage to force a narrow corridor through the British 150th Brigade box. Rommel had tried to break through the South Africans, but had been driven back. The armoured battle continued, but the British First Armoured's attack is slow and cautious. But by the 30th of May, Rommel has lost 200 tanks, just over half the number of tanks he started with, and his second-in-command, General Crowell, has been killed. But that narrow corridor is starting to allow him to resupply. Ritchie finally, after days of delay, asks for a sustained attack upon the Afrika Korps, but his commanders refuse point blank to obey his orders and say caution is needed and further reinforcements. The commander of the 1st Armoured Division, Lumsden, suggests waiting for a night assault by the infantry to clear away the anti-tank guns before the tanks go in. The surrounded French at Bir Hakeim are still fighting on. They're being heavily bombed, but their anti-aircraft guns have taken a terrible toll on the German Stukas. On the 7th, British infantry fight their way through to the French and resupply them, but the fighting is fierce. In the skies, the Desert Air Force is doing quite well. It had lost 31 fighters, but had destroyed over 1,000 German vehicles on the ground. On the 1st of June, Rommel's position is now desperate. He himself is in real danger. His second-in-command, remember, is already dead. His senior staff officer, Westphal, and his chief of staff, Gazala, are now both wounded. He decides he has to break out of the trap he's got him in. And so he attacks once again the 150th Brigade. The 150th Brigade is attacked from the front by the Italians and by the rear by the Germans, led by Rommel. And they are left desperately alone. The Germans afterwards said they had huge admiration for how the 150th tried to hold on and fight stubbornly, but they are abandoned. Due to poor leadership, the guns of the British brigades either side of the 150th do not fire on support of their own men. There are British artillery units with guns and ammunition who decide not to fire on the Italians and Germans to safeguard their own ammunition supplies because they're not part of the 150th Brigade. Their senior officers do not order them to try and support the 150th, who then crumble. As this is happening, on the 5th of June, Operation Aberdeen finally begins, that night assault by the infantry against the Afrika Korps. The infantry overrun the German pickets, but then stop and fail to push on for the anti-tank guns, meaning that in the morning, a day's been wasted for no gain. The anti-tank gun screen is still there. And by now, Rommel has already cleared the minefields of the 150th Brigade and resupplied and repaired and managed to recover huge numbers of German tanks. Tucker goes to see Auchinleck and begs for an all-out assault, but Auchinleck refuses to order Ritchie to launch that all-out assault. He says it's Ritchie's business, leave Ritchie to control the battle. On the 10th, the French at Bir Hakeim could hold out no longer, and the position is lost. And by the 11th, the British infantry is still grimly holding on to their trenches and their battalion boxes. But Rommel works on slowly destroying all the small British armoured forces sent against him. On the 13th, Ritchie decides the battle for the Gazala line is lost. The South Africans pull back into Tobruk, which has been left unguarded, and the British start to retreat towards Egypt. On the 20th of June, Tobruk and 38,000 men surrendered to the Germans. Churchill was told while he was in a meeting with Roosevelt, and he broke down crying. It was a terrible blow to British pride and prestige. The words of General Tucker, this was one of the worst fought battles in the history of the British Army. British forces are left with a small screen on the Egyptian border, but they fall back slowly to the railway station at El Alamein, where the 6th Australian Division, fresh back from fighting the French in Syria, are starting to dig in. Rommel captures huge quantities of supplies and vehicles, particularly trucks, in Tobruk. But El Alamein is a natural defensive point with the Qatar Depression to the south. It's a sinkhole. You can't drive over it. It's a huge sinkhole. And it's the south of El Alamein. You can't put armoured vehicles through that. And so Rommel knows that he'll have to break through there quick. But with the British humiliated and with the Germans poised to launch their attack, driving for Stalingrad and oil, I think, much like Churchill when given that news, we're in need of a stiff drink. And so there we will leave it for 10 minutes, I think they suggested, so that we can raid the toilets, we can raid the bar, and I will see you all, I have no idea what time it is now, but in 10 minutes' time. Thank you very much. So, on the 25th of June, there is a motion of no confidence in Winston Churchill, but the motion fails. Eisenhower is appointed commander of the European theatre for US troops. There were calls to stop the bombing campaign over Germany. I know that sounds odd with the war going so badly for the British, but the British are there going, well, surely we could use these bomber aircraft more effectively than missing German cities. And the House of Commons debates scrapping the bomber campaign of Germany so that we can send those aircraft over the Atlantic and the desert. But it's not necessary. If the Americans had actually put their ships into convoys, the convoy war, it would have been clear, would already have been well on the way to being won. As for the Desert Air Force does have enough planes if Auchinleck and Ritchie could manage to fight a battle semi-competently. They had enough equipment to win. Even so, Spitfires and 300 new tanks are sent out to Egypt. But the morale in the Desert Army is now incredibly low. On the 29th of June, Mersa Matruh falls, and the 8th Army, since the end of May, has lost half of its fighting force, while the Africa Corps has been busily stealing its equipment and has replaced 50% of its losses with captured British kit. And so, if you look at some of the video footage from the time, it's very hard to tell the difference between some British and German formations, because the German formations are driving around in British trucks and using British tanks. And everybody uses the Italian stuff because everybody steals the Italian stuff. The British nick it off the Italians, the Germans nick it off the Italians, and everybody takes, although everyone recognizes that the Italian stuff is easily the worst stuff out there, it does get stolen by absolutely everybody. And so the Africa Corps is busy looting our kit. In Cairo, British staff officers start to burn papers, convinced that the Suez Canal is about to fall. But German losses are mounting. On the 1st of July, Rommel tries to break through the British defences at El Alamein. But by the 3rd of July, the German divisions out in the desert are down to 10% of their fighting strength. And the New Zealanders at El Alamein are fighting hard. The Desert Air Force under Cunningham, one of the great air commanders, is wreaking absolute havoc upon the Africa Corps. They have been conducting round-the-clock bombing of the Africa Corps since the 25th of June. Now, it is hard to attack at night, and the Royal Navy had a lot of aircraft out there that were useless for ground bombing, including the Albacore torpedo bomber. The Albacore torpedo bomber, horrible design. It's a torpedo bomber that was replaced by the aircraft that it had been designed to replace. And so it was meant to replace the Swordfish. The Albacore did so badly that the British replaced the Albacore with the Swordfish after it had replaced the Swordfish. However, we had them out in Egypt with no targets at that time. And so we started to fly the Albacores over the desert to drop flares to light up the German forces like Christmas trees so that the Wellingtons can go over at night and hit them hard at night as well as the day. The Cunningham is really starting to think out of the box to be able to use the aircraft that he's got. On the 3rd of July, the Desert Air Force flew 1,000 sorties against the Luftwaffe's 203. With Rommel halted, Auchinleck launches 2 counterattacks, but both achieve nothing. On the 12th of July, Rommel asks the German government for more troops, saying he's been frequently let down by the Italians. What's terrible about that is the Italians find out. The Italians get given a copy of Rommel's assessment of their armies, and they are furious. The Africa Corps is exhausted. It's down to 30% strength in men, 15% strength in tanks, 70% in artillery, and 40% in anti-tank guns. They're short of supplies, and at the end of an incredibly long supply chain, with the British getting stronger by the day. And at sea, the convoy war continues. On the 27th of June, this convoy is sent out, PQ-17, bound for Russia, with 300 aircraft, 600 tanks, 4,000 trucks, and infantry equipment for 50,000 men on board to go to the Russians. So think of the scale of the equipment we're sending out to Russia there. I mean, 600 tanks, 4,000 trucks. Rommel would probably sell his own leg for 4,000 trucks by this stage. They've all been put onto PQ-17 and sent to Russia. On the 3rd of July, with that convoy out at sea, the British find out by ultra that the German battle cruiser Tirpitz and heavy cruiser Hipper have left port to attack this convoy. On the 4th of July, Admiral Pound, who'd had a good war, he'd made some good decisions, despite the fact that every single one of his officers advised against it, told the convoy to disband and the ships to scatter. He decided that with the Tirpitz loose, the convoy had to scatter, make their own way to Russia in case the Tirpitz attacked the convoy. Everyone begged him not to. If you want to know why he made that decision, it was almost certain that he'd already started to suffer from the brain tumour that would very shortly kill him after this decision. It is the only way to explain the insanity of the decision made by this experienced and competent officer. By the 28th of July, 24 out of 35 of those transport ships had been sunk, sending to the bottom 210 aircraft, 450 Sherman tanks, 3,350 trucks, and 100,000 tons of military equipment. In the Atlantic, however, things are starting to improve. The Americans finally agreed to put their ships into convoys guarded by air cover. It is now almost impossible for the U-boats to operate near Britain or Iceland due to air cover. In July, 12 U-boats are sunk, the highest monthly total yet. And for the first time, more merchant ships are being built than have been sunk. In the air, there is more bad news for Germany. From the 30th to the 31st of May is the first 1,000 bomber raid hitting the city of Cologne. Normally, Britain has 400 bombers available to attack Germany. But Harris borrows 250 from Coastal Command, including some laughably obsolete aircraft, but it will drop stuff. He takes planes out of training, and he uses any obsolete model he can get his hands on. But despite the obsolescence of the bombers attacking, German high command is appalled. 1,000 bombers over a German city in one night. The city is reduced to a firestorm. There are two similar raids that follow in the subsequent weeks. Harris has decided that he's going to start wiping cities off the map, whether they have a military value or not. He's not aiming for factories, he's aiming for cities. And he will intend to wipe them out one by one. If Germany wishes to avoid annihilation, it will have to surrender. Some historians think that if we'd have followed that plan, Germany could have been forced to surrender in 1944. However, it's hugely contested. We have no idea what would have happened if Harris had been allowed to continue what was practically a campaign of genocide against Germany and her civilians, as he cares not for whom he kills. Bomber Command also start receiving Mosquito fast bombers. They're made of wood. They fly at 400 miles per hour or above. They're almost impossible to see on German radar, and they're too fast to catch. They are small, they are nippy, they're almost invisible to German radar. They go in for pinpoint strikes on Germany. And Lancasters are arriving in greater numbers too. Now, Milk, the head of the Luftwaffe, has worked hard to improve production. Messerschmitt and Heinkel, the great German aircraft designers, have been sidelined and told to concentrate just on design. Great designers can't command a factory. Therefore, the factories are taken under government control, and it's really helped. In December 1931, 200 fighters have been produced in Germany. By June, that's nearly doubled to 349. but Britain alone is still outproducing Germany and her empire in all types of aircraft. And in the Eastern Front, on the 30th of June, Germany finally begins what it calls Case Blue. German confidence has risen sky high after Kharkov, and Manstein, one of the greatest German generals, had cleared out Sevastopol, taking the fortress city in the Crimea. But the German formations in the east are still short of almost everything, including their formations are short of 625,000 men. As so far on the Eastern Front, Germany has lost 1,073,066 men. They've also got only 85% of the tanks needed for the plan. The Luftwaffe is now much smaller than it had been over France. As strange as it might sound, the Germans have fewer aircraft for this make-or-break effort than for the invasion of France. And of course, it's across a much bigger space. They don't have the concentration of aircraft. They have also massively underestimated the Red Army. They think the Russians have 6,600 planes. The Russians actually have 22,000. They think the Russians have 6,000 tanks. They actually have 24,446. They think the Russians have 7,800 guns in terms of heavy artillery. They've actually got 33,000. The Red Army is much stronger than they think. The Soviets, however, were expecting the Germans to attack towards Moscow. They weren't expecting an attack in the south. And so the Red Army pulls back before the advancing German forces, trading space for time. The Germans push into the Caucasus, but Hitler is increasingly concerned with France. Now, that might seem strange, but a panzer division, a rare and precious thing, had been kept in France throughout the entire start of this campaign, in case the British decided to land in Germany. Now, we have nothing to put there that's ready to fight, but still a precious panzer division is kept back. Early in Case Blue, he becomes convinced the British are poised to invade France and withdraws another second precious panzer division out of the attack against the Russians to be sent to France. He over-concentrates on the battle for Rostov here, which does nonetheless fall. But it means that a lot of forces are being wasted, as Russian forces are rapidly being moved away from Moscow down south. He wastes time with over-concentration, and increasingly he exposes the flanks of German units. His lack of experience of commanding large-scale forces is really starting to tell. Even so, by the end of July, the Soviet army in the southern front has been smashed, and the German advance is rapid. And so we have here Case Blue, German troops pushing into the Caucasian mountains, the Stuka over Stalingrad, the oil fields burning as the Germans start to advance. On the 9th of August, the oil field at Maykop was captured, but not before the Russians had set fire to it themselves to stop the Germans from being able to use it. On the 10th of August, German troops reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. But German vehicles were already breaking down with a lack of spare parts. They're short of spares and their advance is slowing. The oil is useless to the Germans. There is no oil pipeline to get it to Europe. There are no plans to build it. There is no spare manpower to build it if they can get the plans. If they did manage to capture Baku, what was the world's third largest oil field, and it was in the Caucasus, that was their target. If they captured Baku, it would hurt the USSR. But the oil fields of Gyer and Belotrovsk, which are 600 miles east of Moscow, those two alone produce more oil than the entirety of the German Empire combined, and would have been sufficient to keep the Russian war machine supplied with oil by themselves. So even taking Baku, which they failed to take, wouldn't have ended the Russian war economy. Leningrad's position was also improving, as Lake Ladoga has now melted, allowing ships to cross those lakes and to take civilians out of the city and supplies to come in. So far during the siege of Leningrad, 1 million Russian civilians have died. 1 million in that one city. However, now 500,000 are evacuated and another 310,000 soldiers with artillery are put into the city. In early August, the Soviet Philharmonic Orchestra broadcast live from Leningrad to the world with their debut of the Symphony Leningrad, while artillery and the Black Sea Fleet silenced the German artillery around the city to allow them to do this propaganda coup. Now, Manstein, the great German general who captured Sevastopol, is sent north to take Leningrad. He's, after all, an expert in taking fortresses. He is given 6 German divisions and 3 massive railway guns for Operation Nordlicht, or Northern Light, to finally take Leningrad. And it's to be launched at the end of August. However, the Soviets once again attack before the Germans can, on the 19th of August. The Soviet attack goes badly wrong. The Soviets lose 100,000 casualties in wave attacks against Manstein's forces, who only take 26,000 casualties. The problem that Manstein has, although he's taken out 100,000 Russian soldiers for the loss of 26,000 of his own, he can't replace his 26,000, and he needed them to attack Leningrad. And Leningrad is still full of Russian soldiers, and so the attack on Leningrad had to be abandoned, despite the successes of the defensive operation. The Luftwaffe also has to withdraw from supporting the main advance on the Baku oil fields, as the primary target is now Stalingrad. Now, Stalingrad is a good target. There's a tank factory there. It's also on the River Volga. The River Volga is critical to the Soviet war economy. All the oil that flows up from Baku goes up the Volga River. All the supplies we give to the Russians through Persia, if you watched last year's talk or go back and see it, you'll see some lovely pictures of British troops in pith helmets conquering what's now Iran and joining up with the Russian soldiers there. All our supplies that we put into Persia, up into Russia, go up the Volga River. And so it is a valuable target. And Stalingrad is on the Volga River. But it doesn't matter where you cut the Volga supply line, as long as you cut it. But Hitler wants to cut it at Stalingrad because it's a city named after Stalin, and it's where Stalin made his fame during the Russian Civil War 20 years before. And so he becomes obsessed with taking Stalingrad when he doesn't have to. He really doesn't have to achieve his aims. On the 24th of August, Stalin sends his best general, Zhukov, to Stalingrad with orders to hold the city at all costs. With the fighting raging in the east, in the west, the Americans keep on bothering us about having to do something. Now, it has to be said, the British plan for war in 1939 was to fight to the last Frenchman. And now our plan for the war is to fight to the last Russian. We're not in a huge rush to get involved in large-scale pitched battles, but the Americans keep on harping on about invading France with what they call Operation Sledgehammer. We point out to them it won't work. We don't have the landing craft, and most American troops haven't seen even an American tank, yet alone a German tank, and so they're simply not ready to fight. So on the 20th of July, Churchill finally persuades them to agree not to invade France, but to instead invade the French North African Empire, Operation Torch, against the Vichy French in North Africa. It's agreed on the 24th of July. Brooke, our great commander, the man who oversees our multi-front war, gets the Americans to agree to lead that attack. Our argument is, we know the French hate us since we sank their fleet. And we've already killed a load of Frenchmen in Syria. We've killed a load of Frenchmen in Madagascar. We've been bombing France like crazy since they surrendered. We have killed a lot of Frenchmen. We have killed far more Frenchmen than the Germans have so far this war, and they have held that against us, if we're to be honest. And so we know that those French soldiers will fight to the death against British soldiers, but they probably won't do against the Americans. That's the argument we give the Americans, and the Americans buy every word of it. It is, however, part of traditional British strategy to make sure that whoever dies, they're not British. And if we want some British soldiers to be going into action, we'd rather like a thick screen of Americans in front of us before we go over the top. And since they seem keen, they're clearly going to be the ones to go first. And so the Americans agreed to take the lead. We are delighted. It has to be said that very few British troops have actually fought against the Germans in the last 1.5 to 2 years. Now, before people go, well, what about the desert? There are British troops out there, but they are a minority. Out in the desert, we have a lot of free Polish troops. We have some free French troops. We have an awful lot of Australians, South Africans, New Zealanders, and Indians. Surprisingly few British. The argument we've given to the Dominions, our empire, is that they just happen to be closer, and the British and Canadians will go to Britain where they will prepare for the great battle that will win the war at some stage, but not this year or not next, in Europe. Very few British troops have actually seen action since Dunkirk. The bulk of the British Army still don't have the weapons they abandoned on the beaches of Dunkirk, because every time we make weapons, we ship them out to the Middle East and the Far East. And so a lot of British troops haven't actually got equipment yet, and they've been waiting for the glorious day while Empire troops keep on carrying the can. Now, in the air, the US believes that night bombing would never be effective. The Americans say to Bomber Harris, look, if you bomb at night, you can't hit the factories. And they wonder why Harris starts a manic laughter when bombing of the factories is mentioned, because the Americans are going to try and actually hit the factories, whereas the British are just going to try and wipe out cities. So we have a slightly different aim for our bombing campaign. So they decide that they'll go in during the day. Now, their aircraft are better designed for daylight bombing than ours. The American B-17 had 13 machine guns of a .5 caliber. That will do a real damage to a German aircraft. Our Lancasters are fitted with Brownings with .303 caliber. It'll put a lot of holes in German aircraft, but shoot down very few. And so our bombers have to go in at night because they're underarmed. They can't protect themselves. However, the British do know how to use the bombers they've got. On the 13th of August, we create the Pathfinder Force, elite air crews that will go ahead of the main group. They will then drop incendiary bombs, burn it, light that city up like a Christmas tree. Bomber Command will then follow up and aim to drop bombs on the places that are already burning. And we hope that that will allow us to finally start hitting the target. The American 8th Air Force, however, still has a lot to learn. They don't launch their first attack until September. They can only launch 4 attacks in the next month. On the 26th of September, their attack is escorted by 12 fighter aircraft. 11 of those fighter aircraft, however, run out of fuel while flying back over France and have to land in German-occupied France, where they hand over themselves and their aircraft to some rather surprised Germans who watch 11 American fighter aircraft come out of the sky, asking if they got any fuel. And so training clearly has to be improved for the American Air Force. On the 19th of August, however, in an assault designed to try and help the Russians, we do finally hit a beach, the Dieppe raid. The Americans are really keen for us to launch this. We say that we'll do it to try and learn the difficulties of amphibious landing. However, we use Canadian troops, not British. There's no point risking our lads. There's no point having an empire if you can't start to throw your weight around. So the Canadians are largely the men who will go. There are some British there, but mostly Canadians, with an overwhelming air cover to try and hit the beach of Dieppe. The idea is to try and seize some more Enigma data and also to learn about amphibious landings. It is a disaster. They never get off the beach. Half are killed or captured. 106 aircraft are lost. But it highlighted what we've been telling the Americans all along about the difficulties of landing on French beaches. Now, on the home front, German steel production has fallen through the floor in the winter of 41 because the railway network is so busy moving supplies to the Eastern Front, it can't move coal to the steel mills. And so you have coal building up that can't go to the steel mills, so Germany doesn't produce enough steel, as there's a coal shortage. This is worsened by one of the greatest things the French do at this stage in the war. They go on strike, and we all know the French know how to do a strike. And so they go on strike in the coal fields in the summer of 41 due to a lack of food. But the demand for German coal is huge. It makes their synthetic oil. It produces their electricity. It powers their railway network. It heats their homes. They use it to make steel. But German coal mines are aging and inefficient. On the 11th of August, Hitler and Pleischer, the head of the German coal industry, meet. And they decide to conscript tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Polish people to go and work in German coal mines. And so now you've got Germany for the Germans, where the farms are full of Russians and the coal mines are full of Ukrainians and Poles. Hitler turns to Herr Pleischer. Herr Pleischer, if due to the shortage of coking coal, the output of the steel industry does not reach the plan, then the war will be lost, which really shocks Pleischer. Now, the German atomic program has also come into difficulties. On the 4th of June, Speer called a meeting to discuss the German atomic bomb project. It's difficult because apart from Heisenberg, most of the German physicists had been Jewish, and they'd obviously fled Germany. So people like Otto Fritsch, he came to work for the British atomic weapons program and then went to work for the Americans. As an aside, in 1938, Germany was leading the race to get a nuclear bomb. In 1940, Britain was leading the race to build an atomic bomb, thanks to German Jewish scientists. We then gave all our technical data, and most of our scientists got relocated to America. The deal was, if they paid the cost of the research, we would give them our technical data, we'd give them our scientists, they could have the first atomic bomb, we would have the second atomic bomb. They would have the third, we would have the fourth. When they produced 2 atomic bombs, our government said, great, you've got our atomic bomb then. And they said, no, we're not going to honour that deal because we have atomic weapons and you don't, and what are you going to do about it? Which was an argument. It was certainly an argument. And with hindsight, we may have wanted to have read the small print on that more. But Heisenberg at this meeting requests only a small budget for the atomic bomb project. Now, after the war, he said that he only asked for a small budget because he didn't want the Nazis to have an atomic weapon. So he deliberately, according to him, sabotaged his own project to build the Nazi nuclear bomb. What a load of rubbish. However, it did get him off some serious war crimes trials. He had met with some of the Jewish German scientists in Copenhagen as they were trying to flee Germany. He met them, and they had a meeting where they discussed whether an atomic bomb was possible. And the Jewish scientists who met him, he said, do you think, because he knew they were better than him, he said, do you think we can actually build an atomic bomb? And they said they didn't know what to tell him. They said, because they didn't know if he was pro-Nazi or not. And they said, if he's not pro-Nazi, we might want to say, yeah, it's possible. For the love of God, would you slow your research? But if he is a Nazi, you don't want to tell him that you can build an atomic bomb, because they'll build an atomic bomb. And so they would look at him and looking at each other, going, what should we tell him? And they decided to go, no, it's not actually possible. Anything you spend on atomic research is going to be wasted, mate. And then fled to Britain. And his response was largely, thanks, mate, because if I waste my boss's resources, they're going to be really mad with me. I appreciate that. That's a solid. Thanks. After the war, he said that he knew that they were lying to him and deliberately sabotaged his own project. It's almost certainly rubbish. However, he was working not on an atomic bomb, but a hydrogen bomb, which wouldn't be built until 1954. So they weren't aiming for a small nuke. They were aiming for a big nuke, which probably also slowed their research. But the war rages on in the desert. And as it does, Malta becomes more and more critical. By July, the Allies again have control of the skies over Malta. In April and May, most Axis convoys got through because Malta was being bombed flat. However, now they're no longer bombing Malta flat because their aircraft are fighting in the desert. Now Malta is back in the fight. And so very few Axis convoys are getting through to the desert. And Rommel is running out of supplies. So instead of telling the supplies trains to go to Tripoli and Benghazi at the front lines, Rommel makes the decision to tell the convoys, don't go to Tripoli and Benghazi, the ports at the front. Instead, I want you, don't go to Tobruk at the front, go to Tripoli and Benghazi where it's safe. And as soon as Rommel changes where those supply convoys go, it really pays off. Previously, only around 10% of supplies got through. Now 95% of the supplies are getting through. And Rommel congratulated himself and went, see, logistical genius. Previously it was getting sunk, now it is arriving in Africa. And it certainly is. 91,000 tons of supplies started to arrive in Libya. 91,000. But Rommel needs 100,000. And he needs 100,000 tons of supplies at the front line. What he's getting is 91,000 tons of supplies in Libya. The port of Tripoli is 1,300 miles away from the front lines. The port of Benghazi is 800 miles away from the front lines. That is a long way to drive oil. Worse, it takes quite a lot of oil to drive oil 1,300 miles. So he suddenly realized he needed a lot more trucks and a lot more oil to move the oil to where the tanks were 1,300 miles down the road. And that's a real problem, especially as the Desert Air Force is blowing those supply lines to bits and they're running across these gentlemen. This is the SAS, who love to blow up trucks. And so, after the failure of their first mission in November 1941, they had stopped airborne drops and instead drove across the desert as part of the Long-Range Desert Group. During Operation Crusader, 21 men destroyed 109 aircraft on the ground at Sirte. In March, they had destroyed a fuel dump at Benghazi, and that fuel was expensive and difficult to get to the desert. In June, they raided the Luftwaffe repair depots, hangars and fuel dumps. In July, they attacked the Italian airfields, destroying 30 planes and 40 vehicles. They then attacked the Fuka airfield, and it's a triumph. 37 planes were destroyed of the most precious type. The most precious aircraft the Germans had were not fighters or bombers, but the Ju-52 transport plane. It looks like a pig, quite frankly, that's flying. However, it's a transport aircraft. They are worth their weight in gold. And I always mention when they're shot down. They lost a lot of them on the 10th of May 1940, dropping German paratroops over Belgium, never replaced the losses. They lost huge numbers over Crete, never replaced the losses. Why are they so valuable? Rommel needs supplies, and he needs them at the front lines. The quickest thing you can do is to fly them to the front lines. These transport planes are worth more than their weight in gold. And the SAS catch a load of them on the ground and blow them up. And so with the Germans desperately short of them, more of them have been destroyed. I know it's not glamorous, you don't get films about transport aircraft, but these things, they're really precious. Quite frankly, they need to guard them better. And so then we have the importance of Malta. Despite Malta's key role in attacking Axis convoys in August, the island is starving and the island is desperately short of fuel. A convoy in June had been sent out to try and help them and resupply them, but had been forced to turn back. Despite the RAF successes, the island would soon have to surrender. Operation Pedestal is launched to try and save the island. The supplies must get through. It's the most heavily armed convoy so far in the war. There are 14 ships, including one tanker, and they have to fight their way through with the Axis knowing they're coming. A submarine sinks the carrier HMS Eagle. 2 cruisers and a destroyer are sunk. One by one, the merchantmen are sunk as they crawl their way across the Mediterranean in a fierce battle. There are aircraft, there are submarines, there are surface ships, torpedo boats. Everything is being hurled against this convoy as it limps its way across the Mediterranean. But despite fierce fighting, 5 merchantmen managed to reach Malta, including the tanker Ohio. The Ohio is actually hit 50 miles away from the island, and they must get this through. It's the only tanker left in the tanker in the convoy, but they managed to tow it the last 50 miles of the way. It's really difficult to take a ship under tow while people are trying to blow you up, and the ship itself is full of oil. I don't want to go on a load of oil when people are shooting at it. I certainly don't want to put a tow rope across it, and yet they do. And they managed to get it there to the island. And this time, they use troops to desperately unload it as quickly as they can. A Stuka, as it gets in towards Malta, a Stuka crashes down onto the oil tanker, which if I was on there, my heart would stop, quite frankly. The sight of a burning enemy plane hitting an oil tanker that I'm on would not add to my day. And yet they managed to kick it off, as it were, and drag it back into Malta. And the island is resupplied to carry on its raiding of the crucial supply lines. And in Africa, Rommel is now desperately short of supplies. 9 vessels set off from Italy, heading to Libya. Rommel wants to break the El Alamein line quick. He knows if he can't break it now, he will never break it. And he works out how many supplies he's going to need. They get 9 ships, and he needs all 9 ships to arrive. I mean, it's not a good start. And he needs it to arrive at the front lines. So it's going to go straight into Tobruk. 9 Italian ships are going to race across the Mediterranean. They must get into Tobruk, otherwise Rommel doesn't have the supplies to break the El Alamein line. He knows he needs them, but he knows he can't wait for the British. And so he decides he will launch the attack before the supplies arrive, hoping they arrive during the battle to resupply his army to carry on the attack. And so those ships have set off, but Malta has just got a load more oil to put into all those nice shiny planes on the island of Malta, just waiting for an Italian ship to cross the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, in the desert, on the 3rd of August, Auchinleck had made one last effort to push the Germans back, but got nowhere. Churchill and Brooke went to see him, and they told him that he had to try and attack, but he wasn't getting on well with the Dominion generals. He was refusing to attack, as he was worried the Germans would soon break into Iraq and Iran through Russia. I mean, the very idea of crossing the Caucasian mountains quickly. I mean, you might be able to do it, given a year or so, if the Russian army's not in the way. But there's a Russian army in the way, there's the Caucasian mountains in the way. How do you even supply an army across that mountain range? It's difficult. But he's convinced it could happen at any stage soon. So he says we can't attack the Germans in case we had to withdraw troops to send them to Persia to try and protect against the collapsing Russian front. Now, Churchill has no patience with this, and so Auchinleck is gone. And they need a new general for the desert. The man that Churchill wants is this man here, Strafer Gott, a good general, and he's got a good record of fighting in the desert. However, Strafer Gott is absolutely exhausted. He doesn't want the job. He begs Churchill not to appoint him. In an effort to avoid being appointed, he says, look, if you're going to make me do this, I want 3 months' leave in Britain. Yeah, because I'm in Egypt at the moment. I want to go and see my family. 3 months, that's my price, thinking that Churchill will never agree to it. To his surprise, Churchill actually agreed and said, OK, you're now in command of 8th Army. You've got 3 months' leave in Britain. And they sent a transport plane to take him from the desert to Britain so that he can have his leave, which rather surprised him, actually. He was like, this is not quite what I thought. The Germans managed to get hold of that bit of news. They knew that our great desert general was flying in an unarmed transport plane back to Britain. Now, the man that Gott suggested, because he didn't want the job, he suggested this man, Montgomery, who had had a good performance in France in 1940 and had been a real pain for the army in the 1930s. In the 1930s, when he left his office, he always said that Britain was going to lose the next war if no one listened to him, and he would salute the lamppost outside the War Office on his way home every night, saying that when we lost the Second World War, that would be the lamppost they'd hang the War Office from after we lost the war. And so he'd salute it, saying that's where his boss would die, which strangely did not endear him to the head of the army. However, he may have had a point. At one stage, he was so upset with the British Army trying to keep horses and not investing in tanks, he designed a tank that would drop horse manure in the hope that it would try and please the cavalry regiments. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously, but you can understand why, therefore, this man got ignored for most of the early stage of the war. He was a right pain, quite frankly, to work with. And I'm sure my bosses can sympathise. And so, on the 7th of August, the Germans learn that Gott is flying back to Britain, and they shoot his transport plane down. 6 Bf-109s are sent to find it. They shoot it down. It lands safely, and so they strafe it on the ground. It explodes, and Gott burns to death in the desert. It was really unusual The Desert War is occasionally referred to as the Gentlemanly War. It was nothing of the sort. It was a brutal and barbaric campaign, but you didn't normally shoot people down when they were shot down on the ground. But the Germans were so keen to kill Gott, who had a good record, that they shot his Panzer down and burned him to death on the ground. He had, at that stage, been our second best performing general. Our best performing general, by the way, was still in a prisoner of war camp in Italy, General O'Connor. He will be rescued, though, for later talks to carry on his good work. And so Alexander is put in charge of the Middle Eastern theatre. Now, he has had an interest in war. He was the last man to be picked up off the beach of Dunkirk. He was given command of the evacuation of Dunkirk from the army point of view. He was then sent out to Burma after Singapore fell to try and get British troops out of Burma. He has had a fine career of getting British troops out of combat zones. If you need to get home, he's the man for you. And so the British Desert Army aren't quite sure how to take the appointment of General Alexander, because he is an expert on getting you out fast. And we're there going, well, Rommel's beaten us hollow so far, and here he comes. We'll be home soon, boys. Don't worry, we're going home. But he decides to appoint for the front line. It's an unfair reputation, by the way. He's a really good general, excellent First World War record, and he is a fighting general. But he just keeps on getting sent by the government to evacuate troops. What can you do? You're going to have to just do your best, aren't you? And so he decides that Montgomery, these two, by the way, fierce rivals. They work together well, but both are convinced the other one's an idiot and should listen to them more. But they do manage to mercifully work together reasonably well. On the 30th of August, Rommel launches this attack with these 9 ships still coming across the Mediterranean that he needs to arrive. By midday, 6 out of 9 of them have already been sunk. The attack continues. They've been sunk by Malta-based aircraft. By the end of the first day, the last of the Italian oil tankers, the San Andreas, was also sunk. Rommel was now also very ill. He'd asked the German government to be sent home. He'd also asked to be replaced by Guderian, the man that Hitler had sacked. Rommel said, I'm ill, you need to send more troops, I need to go home, and you need to send Guderian out here. Guderian is the only man that can win the war. Saying to Hitler, the man you've sacked is the only one that can win this war, is not going to endear you to Hitler, because Hitler does not respect Guderian, because Guderian does not respect Hitler. And so he is ignored. Now, the Battle of Halfa is similar to Gazala, and it shows how ill Rommel was. His plan was the Italians would attack in the north and the centre, and he'd loop around the south, encircle the British at El Alamein, and therefore destroy them. But the British have got a thick minefield, and by 2 in the morning, the German tanks try to go through the minefield and are halted by the new British 6-pounder anti-tank gun. They're also bombed heavily by the Desert Air Force. 30 tanks are destroyed, and 3 out of 4 of the German generals are killed on the first day. The only German general in Africa not to be killed is Rommel. The rest of them have gone, which is unfortunate, because the rest of them understood supplies. Rommel, better battlefield commander, he did need somebody to do the supply work, and now they're dead. The Germans slowly ground forwards, but then they ran out of fuel, because it's now at the bottom of the Mediterranean, or our burning across the Mediterranean, isn't it? And so the attack grinds to a halt. The British counter-attack, but they achieve little. They're led by the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry. Do you remember those poor blokes who got sent out with horses in 39 and then got given an instruction manual and some guns at the Battle of Knightsbridge? After Knightsbridge, they were given tanks. Now you can imagine their surprise. They were like, wait, what are these? They're like, it's okay, they're like the guns you had, but they move. You know movement. Just think that they're a horse with the gun on top. You're like, oh, you're kidding me, aren't you? And so they had tried to learn how to use tanks. And their attack was glorious because they were cavalrymen. And they had trained for the charge with pennants flying. And so they were like horses, you say? And so they had their little pennants on the tanks, and they charged across the desert with guns blazing on the move. And the Germans couldn't believe their eyes as they picked those tanks off as they charged tally-ho across the desert in the finest traditions of the British cavalry. It achieves nothing. On the other hand, oh, for the glory of a cavalry charge in a metal box. But the Air Force keeps on pounding the Germans. The Air War is fierce. The Germans have a fighter ace out there, Jochen Marseille. The man is insane. He shot down 17 British fighters in a single day, but didn't like to attack bombers. He thought it was unsporting to shoot down bombers, because it's not an even duel, is it, really? If you're in a fast fighter, not sporting, really. He was respected by both sides, known as the Star of the Desert. He used to, if a British pilot got killed behind the German lines, because he shot them down, he would try and land next to the person he shot down, recover their dog tags, and then try and fly over the British airbase to throw out any personal letters, personal effects, and the dog tags, because he said he didn't want the families not to know what happened to their beloved. He used to write little letters. Sometimes British families would occasionally get letters from him saying, I just want you to know, your son fought really bravely. He fought really well. He was a good opponent. British anti-aircraft gunners learnt to recognise his aircraft and wouldn't open fire on his aircraft. It was flying over a British airfield, because they knew that he would never shoot a British aircraft on the ground, because it wouldn't count towards his score. And they knew that if he was over one of our airfields, he was clearly delivering some bad news to somebody, and we might as well get the news. Respected from both sides, but clearly insane. And so he shoots down 17 British fighters in a day, but not the bombers. Those bombers are doing terrible things to the Afrika Korps. Monty holds in this first battle. The 8th Army was growing now and growing in confidence. But even so, in that battle, we had lost more men and more machines than the Germans. Clearly, training would have to continue. And then as a side, if you've ever had the full Monty breakfast, it's named after General Montgomery, because he said that men couldn't be expected to fight unless they'd had a fry-up and had steak on a regular basis. Really popular with the troops. They're like, yeah, make with the food. And so returning to the east, the battle for Stalingrad begins on the 23rd of August. 1,000 tons of bombs are dropped in the first 48 hours, more than was dropped on London at the height of the Blitz. The Soviet Air Force, the VVS, suffers appalling losses over the city. Initially, the city is defended by an all-female anti-aircraft unit, the 1077th Russian Anti-Aircraft Battery. They fight the German tanks shot for shot, shocking the Germans when they discover that they're fighting against an all-woman unit. The Germans say, this is a sign that Russia is about to lose the war. Look, they're putting women into the front lines. Not a bit of it. Stalin just doesn't care who dies for Stalin, as long as it's not him. And so the Russians use quite a lot of women in the war, as it happens, in the front line. By the end of August, the Germans reach the Volga, north of the city. But the German flank, 600 miles long, is guarded by the Hungarian Second Army, the Romanian Third Army, and the Italians. Now, I don't know what you're thinking when you're thinking of the Romanian Third Army. I mean, they've not got great equipment to start with. What are they given to their third, not their first? The Hungarian army, incredibly brave. Their tank, the Toldi tank, its main weapon is a bolt-action rifle. It was never meant to see combat. It had been designed by the Swedes before the war to showcase a new kind of suspension they'd built. The armour is paper thin, the gun is a rifle because it's not meant to fight. They built it for a trade show, going, look, we've designed this new suspension. And then the Hungarians came along and went, oh, look at that, it's a tank. Can we buy hundreds? And they're like, well, yeah, but yeah, fine, just buy the lot. Why not? And so they'd sold the Toldi tank to the Hungarians. It's not going to be fighting the T-34. If you want to see a Toldi tank, by the way, one country still has them. The Irish army has one Toldi tank. You're not allowed to see it. I really wanted to. I went to Ireland. I was like, they've got a Toldi in Dublin, haven't they? I want to see it. And so I wrote to the Irish army, dear sir, can I please see your Toldi tank? They said no, because it was a military secret. It's still in active service. They said it's the only tank they've still got in active service. If the British Army crosses from Northern Ireland to try and invade the south, They're going to activate that toldy and hurl it against the British. What poor Irishman's going to be put in that? It was junk in 42. And so the Hungarians are guarding this flank. Brave, badly equipped. The Romanians, by the way, have been given captured French equipment left over from the fall of France. It's all right. But on the other hand, it's a bit old and a little bit bullet damaged by this stage. But there they are, guarding the flank. On the 5th to the 18th of September, the Soviets launch a massive counterattack aimed at driving the Germans back from the city, but it fails. The Soviets lose over 100 tanks, 80 aircraft, and by the 12th of September, the Soviet defense of the city had been reduced to just 90 tanks and 20,000 men of the 62nd Army. The Germans try to storm the city, fighting building by building on the 14th of September, but fail. So far in the east, the Germans have lost 1,637,280 men. In the fighting of the railway station changes hands 14 times in a single day. Out in the Atlantic, the U-boats are finding it harder and harder. Huffduff, a detection system which could pick up the radio signals from the German U-boats, allows us to guide our bombers to where the German submarines are. But the Germans have introduced a fourth rotor arm to their Enigma machine, making it more difficult to break their codes. Dönitz, for the first time, is getting the numbers of U-boats that he'd asked for. He's finally been given 200 serviceable U-boats, but his request for aircraft to be designed to help them operate over the Atlantic are rejected due to a lack of technical staff and technical data. And the torpedoes his U-boats have are still the same rubbish torpedoes in 39 that were misfiring then, and they're still misfiring now. And so if you heard my 1939 talk, you'll know that many British battleships were hit by dozens of torpedoes that failed to explode. The Norway campaign could have been even worse for us if their torpedoes had worked. They're still using the same torpedoes that still aren't working properly, and it's costing the U-boats. Also, the U-boats have lost their experienced crews dead, and they now have inexperienced crews against increasingly experienced escort crews. Germany is now full of foreign workers and slave labourers, all of whom have to be watched. But they can't be watched, they can't be fed, they can't be housed. And from April to August 1941, 42,714 Russian prisoners of war escape from German farms and start roaming the German countryside. There's now over 40,000 Russian soldiers loose in Germany that can't be captured because there aren't the German men to try and round them up. Germany has been hollowed out. Back in Stalingrad, by the 27th of September, Germany holds the southern part of the city, but the centre and north are still in Russian hands. The Luftwaffe was flying nearly 1,000 sorties a day, and the Romanians were also heavily committed to the fight for the city. The Germans pull aircraft out of the drive for the Caucasus. Remember, their main target was the Caucasus, but they now withdraw the aircraft from the Caucasus to help in Stalingrad. Air losses are high, so that by November, the Soviet Air Force outnumbers the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front, but the Germans still have the advantage in terms of quality. Slowly, the Germans grind forwards, so that by October, the Soviet defenders are reduced to a 1-kilometre strip along the River Volga. Over Malta, on the 11th of October, 700 Axis aircraft are hurled against the island in one last effort to break the island of Malta. Axis air losses against the British Spitfires are horrific. By the 13th of October, the Axis lose their 1,000th aircraft in the skies over Malta. Think about that, a tiny island, 1,000 aircraft lost over that island. The fighting is furious in the skies there. The final air assault cost them 350 planes alone, and 9 more Axis transport ships are sunk in the Mediterranean, carrying 41,409 tons of supplies to Rommel in the desert. The Luftwaffe has been all but broken over Malta, over Britain, and over Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe is no longer able to control the skies over any front. In the desert, by mid-October, Montgomery has built up a force of 1,000 tanks, but tank training is slow. The tank regiments were plodding and slow and kept too close to the infantry. They want to act like a First World War tank where the infantry walk behind. That's their idea of how to fight. The cavalry regiments are still having a tendency to charge off as if they're on horseback. The yeomanry still are trying to work out how to turn the tanks on, as it were. But slowly the British tank forces are learning. Monty comes up with a simple plan and makes them rehearse it again and again and again behind the lines. He creates dummy German positions and gets the British to practice attacking it again and again and again. The 8th Army is well supplied, highly mechanised, and grown in confidence, if lacking in flair. The air war is also heating up in the skies over the desert. On the 30th of September, Hans Marseille, that star of the desert, is killed after 158 victories. He took off despite knowing that he had a dodgy engine. He was told they were struggling to get supplies to the Luftwaffe in the desert, and therefore they couldn't replace his engine. Those supply losses really matter at times, don't they? Despite having a dodgy engine, he took off and shot down a number of British aircraft. But on the way back, the engine cut out, he crashed and died. He died on the British, by the way, gave him a decent send-off. They gave him a burial with full honours, as they respected him as an opponent. The Afrika Korps is now seemingly struggling with severe supply issues. Rations are cut and cut and cut again, and men are falling sick simply from a lack of food and a lack of water. Rommel goes to Germany to ask for more supplies and men. When he gets to Italy, he notices that all the Italian docks have huge mountains of supplies. And he asks why they're there and not in the desert. And he's told that the Italians don't have the ships to take them from those ports to the desert anymore. They had been using ever smaller ships as they had been losing all the big ships. By 1941, they were using very small ships. They're inefficient, because you need to burn the oil to move these small ships. And now they've run out of them too. And they rather pointedly pointed out to the Germans that they would have built more ships, but somebody at the start of the year had cut off their supplies of steel. So they hadn't been able to build the ships. And so the Germans had been sending supplies to the Afrika Korps, and they'd been delivering them to the Italian ports. The Italians were like, yep, there they go. Next to the previous lot, and the previous lot, and the previous lot. Mounding up while they lack the ships to take them across the Mediterranean. Most of those ships have been sunk by planes and submarines out of Malta. On the 23rd of October, 1942, Montgomery, after long planning, launched his attack for the Battle of El Alamein. And with the German army stuck in Stalingrad, with the Luftwaffe in ruins, with Germany full of hard-to-control foreign workers, with the Desert Army poised for its attack, there we will leave the 1942 talk, and I hope that you'll join me again for next year's Remembrance Day for our 1943 talk. Thank you very much.